Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm continuing my series about the Russian Civil War. So I got to 1918, and I was talking about the Czech Legion. They wanted to avoid entanglement in internal Russian controversies. Their priority was to get home. They're trapped in Siberia because when they're taken as prisoners of war, they're brought as far from their homeland as possible to make escape pointless because they just weren't going to be able to get through so much Russian territory undetected. Anyhow, so in October 1918, Czechoslovakia was proclaimed as an independent nation just as Austria-Hungary was collapsing, defeated. So the Czech Legion wanted to avoid being drawn into these internal Russian disputes. But the Reds would not let the Czech Legion out. They felt it was a tool of the French and the British. And to get from Siberia to Czechoslovakia, there was thousands of miles of Russian territory. So Czechia was very industrialized and had quite a strong trade union movement. The Bolsheviks sought its fertile territory for another Bolshevik revolution. And because the Reds would not allow the Czech Legion out, the Czech Legion was forced into the hands of the Whites. The Bolsheviks perceived the Czech Legion as being a bourgeois nationalist force. To some extent, they were correct. The Czech Legion was highly united, unlike a lot of the Whites. The Czech Legion controlled much of the Trans-Siberian Railway, and they fought effectively on the White side. A couple of years later, a deal was worked out. They were allowed to get to the Pacific, get a ship, and sail all the way back to Europe, finally get home. They're honoured by a street in Bratislava named Legionarski. So the Russian economy had almost stopped functioning. People were bartering because the bottom had dropped out of the economy. There'd been hyperinflation. Since 1914, there'd be almost no consumer goods produced. The transport system was breaking down. Hardly any hospitals or schools were functioning. So many talented young people had been killed. People were starting to flee the country. The place was in anarchy. So many people were starving. There were very few ways to get enough food. One of the obvious meal tickets was to join an army, either one. And some people joined an army for that reason alone. It was a way to eat. And that was the only way to guarantee a sufficient amount of food. So these armies would make feeding their troops their priority. You can forget about civilians. So the Red Army held many cards. They controlled the capital, and that was a big psychological boost. They controlled the second largest city, Moscow, and a few other large cities. They then made this claim they were the rightful government of Russia. They had the centers of industry, therefore able to manufacture weapons. The area under their control was geographically contiguous, so they're able to communicate with each other. Remember, even radio communication was quite a new thing. There was telegraph communication post even, so almost nobody had telephones. So men could be sent from a quiet sector of the front to a beleaguered sector, whereas the Whites were divided geographically and politically and found it almost impossible to communicate with each other because they'd have to send messages across hostile territory, which was virtually impossible. If it did happen, it was going to be very slow. It might well be intercepted and sent on by the Reds, having read the secret message, because they could act on it. The Bolsheviks immediately stated their belief in the total equality of the sexes, and that was quite controversial. That was not something that could be assumed in 1918. So they won over feminists who otherwise harboured some doubts about the Bolsheviks. So they allowed women to rise to any position with the Red Army, including combat troops. Admittedly, the Russian government had done that just beforehand, a few months beforehand, but had been highly tendentious. Anyway, the Whites had only done it in extremis, but the Bolsheviks said, on principle, we consider this acceptable. In March 1918, the Reds had tracked down and killed Grand Duke Mikhail. That's the Tsar's younger brother, his only living brother, because his brother Grand Duke Georgy had died of natural causes about 20 years earlier. So the Whites were very broad church, as I pointed out, far left groups as well as ultra-conservatives. The Socialist Revolutionaries split. Most of the SRs, social revolutionaries, stayed in the Whites, called right SRs. A faction called the left SRs went off and joined the Reds, thinking, what on earth are we doing here with some czarists and reactionaries, no. Okay, the Bolsheviks are not perfect, but they're much closer to our worldview than some of these arch conservatives. So, what do the whites want? A few of them wanted to restore the Tsar with full powers, turn the clock back to 1905. Some of them were Octoberists, said the October Manifesto of 1905. That was the final settlement of Russia's constitution. Others of them said, no, we must have a republic. They might have been like constitutional Democrats and thought the February Revolution was the ideal thing and be a state a bit like France. Others were socialist revolutionaries who said, well, we must have present proprietorship, we must do more for the peasants, particularly the majority class, and to a lesser extent for the proletariat, have social democracy. There were different shades of opinion in between, but it was the right-wing whites who tended to get the publicity, and they were usually the army officers. They had better contacts with the Allied governments. They predominated amongst the civil service. The Reds chose to emphasize this monocled image of reactionary aristocrats as the standard image of the whites wearing their top hats, because they knew that really rubbed people up the wrong way. There was a lot of class hostility, and some people would have to swallow their doubts about the Bolsheviks, saying, we are not having the reactionaries coming back, these toffs who lorded it over us and exploited us for decades, centuries indeed. So, but the whites, what were they going to do? Defeat the Reds, okay, and then what? Restore the Tsar or not? As a figurehead or with full powers? So some whites were utterly opposed to restoration, like the SRs. Even after Nikolai the Last, even after his death, there'll be lots of other relatives, and their claims could be restored. Anyway, after he was killed, the issue of restoration receded. It was fortunate for the Reds that many whites had loathed the Romanovs by this stage, particularly urban workers. The Reds insisted that the whites were hell-bent on bringing back the Tsar, full-blown Tsarism prior to 1905, or even serfdom. Despite protestations to the contrary by the whites, some people believe this. So even a constitutional monarchy would have been unacceptable to quite a few people. And after Nikolai II was dead, which Romanov had the best claim to the throne? It was an open question. The issue of restoration was highly divisive amongst the whites. Only the most blinkered reactionaries thought the Romanovs could come back with full powers. And it was such an unpopular thing that espousal of this policy would be a gift to the Reds. So the whites never officially adopted the restoration of the Tsar as a policy, but the reactionary mannerisms of the whites led to suspicions that they intended to bring back the Tsar. So they gave every impression of being backward-looking. They were living in the past. White officers insisted on gold-braided epaulettes on their uniforms, court etiquette. They squandered time debating such urgent matters as which form of spelling should be used. Of course, they chose the most old-fashioned type of spelling. So they were backward-looking. Anyway, everything about them showed that they elected to go with anachronisms. It indicated just a hidebound, whalebone corseted conservatism. That would be amongst a section of the whites. There were, of course, SRs and constitutional Democrats who are more forward-looking. So a much more prominent issue for most Russians, ordinary people, was not the Romanovs, but a bread and butter issue, land. Literally bread and butter issue. So peasants had seized property in most cases, aristocrats who could have mostly run out of there. Some of the officers on the red side, even a few on the red, but mostly on the white side. After the war, would these peasants be allowed to keep the land they'd seized? Sometimes they've been farming it for decades anyway, but paying rent on it. But now they said, no, we actually legally own it. Sometimes they'd got the landlord to sign it over to them at gunpoint, give them a few kapiki to say it was a legal sale. Would they be allowed to retain it? Some whites said no. The moderate whites, the right SRs, wanted land reform, but only after the Civil War, to be conducted in an orderly and equitable fashion. However, it would be too late, really. That horse had bolted. Some white landowners said this is anathema. No, it must be returned to its rightful owners. These are sort of people who are legitimate, saying the Tsar is still the rightful ruler. So it would be impossible to unscramble an omelette. Land reform had already taken place. So millions of peasants who might have been neutral or even pro-white were made to wonder, should they back the Reds? So years later, Alexander Kerensky was discussing with a former comrade, what if we'd announced, all right, the land you've seized, you can keep it. Kerensky said, if we'd said that, we'd be sitting in St. Petersburg now. We would have won the civil war. He might be exaggerating the importance of that issue, but it certainly mattered. There were a few irredeemable reactionaries amongst the whites, and they alienated the peasants with their stance. But there were other whites who were more reasonable, who would not have minded that being said. So the whites should have been more politically astute, had a more balanced attitude, saying, we can't take back land which the peasants have taken into their own hands. And there were some white reactionaries even hanged trades unionists, and that drove moderate people into the arms of the Reds. People began to think twice about neutrality. It was not a cost-free option. And there were also white atrocities against Jewish people. So Jews had little option but to back the whites to save their own skins.